Hello, and a very warm welcome to our Bond.Forums members and to everyone who is joining us for the first time today. My name is Morana, Bakula, and I have the great pleasure of leading our consulting and design services. And I work with our incredible teams to help our clients transform the experiences they provide for their employees and customers. Over the past 18 months, all of us have been challenged and reshaped as humans and as businesses. During this time, we have seen that this is an optimal opportunity to rethink how we serve people, how we operate, and that work begins with purpose. The job of organizations now is to keep the promise of their purpose. This is the work we do at Bond. It requires not just designing new experiences for employees and customers, but redesigning the way we organize, come together across teams, what we say yes to, and perhaps, more importantly, the things we say no to. That is why I'm so excited to host our friend, Martin Lindstrom. Martin is ranked among the world's top 20 business thinkers, and Time magazine has named him one of the world's 100 most influential people for 3 years running. He's earned this recognition because of his thought-provoking insights and approach, helping brands be what they say they are. Martin is author of 7 books, several of which have been ranked New York Times bestsellers. Most recently, he has released The Ministry of Common Sense, a tangible and often humorous read about the red tape and bad excuses that get in the way of companies being better for their customers and employees. Live from Switzerland, please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Martin. Welcome, Martin.
Well, thank you so much, Morana. It's a pleasure to connect with you again, and what a nice introduction. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here. Before I hand the stage over to you, we will have time for Q&A at the end. So as you listen to Martin, I encourage you all to drop in any questions into the Q&A section so Martin can address them for you at the end of the show. Martin, over to you.
Oh, thank you. And everyone, just shoot the most difficult, tricky questions which is close to your heart, things which are challenging you or just things which you're curious about. Now, I want to take you back in time because a couple of years ago, I went on a holiday in Zambia and I was so lucky to have Malcolm Gladwell, you know, the guy, the tipping point guy. I think he's Canadian, in fact. He was just sitting next to me as we were sitting there on the veranda looking at all these amazing animals. I remember that Malcolm asked me one of those questions which only Malcolm Gladwell can ask. He said, "Have you noticed, Martin, how people are still wearing hats here in Zambia, yet in the rest of the world, those hats have disappeared back in the 70s. Why is that?" You know, I was thinking a little bit about that, I have to say, for about a year. And then I realized the reason why. In fact, it happened in 1969. That was the year where J.F. Kennedy was inaugurated. In fact, he was the first president in the history of the United States not to wear a hat during an inauguration. And you may say to me, not a big deal. I mean, it's just a hat, right? Well, actually, there is a big deal behind this, because what we realized was that back in the days, I presume before going to work, you'd put on the hat and you would be kind of in a work mode, right? And as you would come home, you'd take the hat off if you're a man, and then you'd be in a private mood. And then later on, Steve Jobs managed to basically kill the tie. Suddenly that transformation between work and private would slowly disappear. And it didn't stop here, by the way. Suddenly we all started to install an office in our pocket called the smartphone. Suddenly we would basically do work at home, and home and we'll do the work. I mean, everything will just blur together. And by the way, then 2 years ago, COVID-19 arrived, and we would install a pipeline of bureaucracy going straight into our bedrooms. And suddenly, that separation between private and work once again would be gone. And then you would say, not a big deal. Well, in fact, I would claim it is. And the reason why it is a big deal is because what we've seen happening over the last 20 to 30 years is that the boundaries between private and work had disappeared. Now, in the good old days, we would have terms like B2B and B2C. But I would claim that those two terms actually have become exactly the same. In fact, I would replace that with a term called hates to hates, human to human. Because the reality is that if you have a wife and let's say that she's sending a vase from China in one piece to wherever you live in Canada and it arrives in 3,000 pieces, I'm pretty sure if it was DHL using it and you happen to be responsible for supply or purchasing of courier services, you would say, oh, I'm not sure I want to go with DHL, right? Suddenly the boundaries would blur. And that means that there is kind of some new rules in town. It's a new market, yes, we get that. There's some completely new needs, and that, of course, has amplified due to COVID-19. But with that, there's also a new playbook in town. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about right now. I think the best way of doing that is, in fact, to go back in time. In 1997, I was sitting in the audience along with 3,000 other people. I was in the Moscone Center in San Francisco. And suddenly this crazy inventor went on stage. And he actually was talking about innovation. And suddenly this guy in the audience, he raised his hand and said, hey, I have a question. Something called OpenDoc was developed. You've simplified it so no one can use it. Why did you do that? And here's what he said.
You can please some of the people some of the time, but one of the hardest things when you're trying to affect change is that people like this gentleman are right in some areas. I'm sure that there are some things OpenDoc does, probably even more that I'm not familiar with, that nothing else out there does. And I'm sure that you can make some demos, maybe a small commercial app that demonstrates those things. The hardest thing is, how does that fit in to a cohesive, larger vision that's going to allow you to sell $8 billion, $10 billion of product a year? And one of the things I've always found is that you've got to start with the customer experience and work backwards to the technology. You can't start with the technology and try to figure out where you're going to try to sell it. And I've made this mistake probably more than anybody else in this room. And I've got the scar tissue to prove it. And I know that it's the case. And as we have tried to come up with a strategy and a vision for Apple, it started with what incredible benefits can we give to the customer? Where can we take the customer? Not starting with, let's sit down with the engineers and figure out what awesome technology we have, and then how are we going to market that? And I think that's the right path to take.
You gotta start with the customer first and work backwards towards the technology. Now, it's so simple to say, but what has changed profoundly since Steve Jobs said that is that we are blurring those boundaries between work and private. That means if you have an amazing experience as a private consumer, you're actually much more likely to introduce that in a work context. And that's a reason why you will see that Amazon is a bigger B2B player, using an old term now, than a B2C player, because people love the simplicity of Amazon and basically we're projecting that into the work environment. But how do you get there? Well, I think the way to get that is to look at the world from a different perspective. And here's really the issue with everything. The issue for me is that we increasingly right now are seeing the world from one point of view. I'm looking at all of you right now through a lens, sadly. But it means I'm only seeing you from one point of view. If I was good, I would see you from multiple points of view. That means I would spend time in your homes, on your offices, and see the world from a slightly different angle, exactly as this was revealed in 1980.
An event seen from one point of view gives one impression. Seen from another point of view, it gives quite a different impression. But it's only when you get the whole picture you can fully understand what's going on.
Isn't that thought-provoking? It's an old TV commercial from The Guardian. What it does is really this. It forces us to look at the view from different points of view. And what I'm saying here is we've forgotten about that. We look at data and spreadsheets and a lot of algorithms, but what we don't look at is everything not written on the lines, but in between the lines. And the way you do that, in my opinion, is very simple. As I tend to say, if you want to study animals, don't go to the zoo, go to the Amazon. And the way I sort of picked it up many years ago was really when I first met the founder and the owner back then, the old and the late Ingvar Kamprad. What he did was very simple. He actually started from the customer point of view. And I went to his office in Stockholm, and I remember that I was asking for him and he was not there. I said, "Where is this guy?" And they said, "Well, he's down in the store at the cash register, checking every customer out." Well, sure enough, as I went down there, he was sitting there checking every single customer out. And I remember I said to him during the break, "Why do you do this?" And he said to me, "Listen, I want to look everyone in the eyes and feel what they're thinking. I want to hear what they're feeling. This is the reason why IKEA is what it is today. I'm literally in connection with my customers every day." This is the philosophy. What's so interesting is most people today think that we can do this stuff through screen-based communication and through the numbers, but in my opinion, we can't. Let me just ask you a question, okay? How many of you guys out there, and you can use the chat if you want to do that, just for fun, okay? Be honest now. How many of you would say that you are deeply irrational every day? Deeply irrational every day. Now, if you say, "I'm actually deeply irrational every day," you write yes. And if not, you write no, okay? Now, what you will probably notice is, when I'm looking at the screen right now, there's a lot of no's coming up on the screen right now. Yep, I notice it. There we go. And I had to break the news. I'm sorry about there's a single yes here. Well, stay away from that yes, because that person is dangerous. And the rest of you guys are liars. So what do I mean about that? Well, okay, let's go back to the point here. How many of you have tried that you're watching television, your remote control is flat for battery, so you press extra hard to squeeze the last drop of battery out of that remote control? You tried it? Okay, be honest again now. How many of you have tried it? Write yes or no. Yeah, you see the answer out there right now? You get what I mean? Is that rational or deeply irrational? Well, what I would claim today is that 85% of everything we do every day is deeply irrational. That is where you build a brand. That's where you build brand loyalty. The 50% is where everyone else is competing. That's fine. And all the nuts in the bolt. But where emotions are established is really down in that very bottom underneath the surface. How do you pick it up? Well, I call it small data, seemingly insignificant behavioral observations that point towards one or more unmet customer needs. Now, small data is the opposite to big data. Big data is all about correlation. Small data is all about causation, the reason why, the hypothesis. And here's the problem. Most big data today is based on the wrong premises. In fact, I can give you a concrete, real study done in Stanford, and you don't really need people from Stanford to predict this one, but the study basically showed, using big data, that the more umbrellas you sell, the more it rains. Well, guess what? That's big data. We need the hypothesis first. I think the best way to illustrate that is to go back to Italy. In Italy, there's one of the largest, if not the largest, manufacturer of respiratory disease products in the world. Now, this wonderful company was stuck with one challenge. They wanted to get closer to the patients. And I said to them, "So how much time have you spent with the patients over the last couple of years?" I mean, let me just give you a hint here. This company has been around for nearly 100 years. And their answer was, never. Never? Yeah, we're not allowed to because of compliance. So we started to do a little process. We started to move in with patients just to understand what was going on. We wanted to understand their feelings and emotions. And we ended up with a 28-year-old lady. She had had asthma her entire life. And I remember I asked her one of these profound questions. I said to her, how was it to have patients as a young girl? And she started to cry. And I said to her, but you changed a lot. What happened back then? She said, well, listen, I was teased in school. I was bullied. I was disinvited from parties. In fact, I was a disgrace for human mankind. That's her words. She was obviously very touched by this, and rightly so. But what changed was this. In fact, when I met her, she had quite a lot of self-confidence. And I said, why? She picked out a bag, a handbag, and out of the bag she pulled out a straw. And I said, what does that have to do with this answer? And she said to me, well, I always give this straw to friends, new friends and colleagues and acquaintances, and I ask them to hold themselves from the nose and breathe through the straw for about a minute. And then they feel what I feel. They feel how an asthma patient is feeling. Now, I'll be frank with you, I stole that idea and I basically shared it with the senior management of this large pharma company. And as I did it, they all went through this exercise, breathing through the nose. And at one point, I remember after 30 seconds, one person spit out the straw and said, this is the most ridiculous thing I ever tried. Why are we doing this? And I looked him in his eyes and I said, we're doing this because this is how your patients feel every second of their entire life. And they are paying your salary. And if you could hear a penny drop on the floor, you would have heard it. It was almost like there was a eureka moment going on at this pharma company. They felt suddenly what the patients were feeling. This is the essence of branding, in my opinion. I think there's no better way of explaining this than to quote Maya Angelou, which once said, people will forget what you say, they'll forget what you do, but they'll never forget how you make them feel. And this is my point. We've forgotten how people feel behind that screen. I tend to say that we look at the world, but we never really participate in the world as we're sitting behind Teams and Zoom. But the issue is with branding, that branding is every touch point the client comes in contact with or the entire span of a company's existence. And that means that we need to be much better at communicating those emotions. What is it I'm talking about here? Well, let me give you an example about what not to do. So a brand we worked with for many, many years, which is called Nestle, actually faced this challenge. Some years ago, Nestle bought Gerber. Gerber, as you know, is the largest baby food brand in the United States. A very, very popular brand. Mothers love it. It's been around forever. It really is close to everyone's head and hair and heart. Now, this is interesting. As they acquired Gerber, something strange happened. One of the things Gerber was well known for was that they actually, in their call center, would have real mothers answering the questions for other mothers. Typically mothers during pregnancy or just after the delivery of the baby actually took their time to sit in a call center and ask and answer questions to all the customers calling in. That was a way to bond with the customers, of course with the mothers. But as Nestle acquired the company and systems was taking over, all these people were let go. And suddenly the usual call center was taking over and the emotions slowly disappeared. Suddenly they were not able to feel what the audience was feeling. It's something we see happening quite a lot. I tend to say that what the customer wants is a round hole and the square peg is what we as a company is offering. And goddamn, we're going to squeeze that square peg into that round hole, right? Just to make sure it fits to our systems. We're seeing the world suddenly from inside out, not from outside in. And why is that happening? Well, I call that the immune system, the defense mechanism for change. It is this. By the way, all the speech bubbles you're seeing on the screen right now are real. These are compliance issues and issues coming from everyone. It's too expensive. It's too ambitious. There's too much red tape. Next year, perhaps. Basically, it can't be done. Legal is an excuse. You know all the drills here. And this is the issue we have. The issue we have is that we increasingly are floating away from what the customer's mindset is, thinking we understand and feeling the emotions because we can see it through the screen. But again, remember the remote control? Remember that feeling is only something you can feel if you tried it, i.e. empathy has to happen. That straw where you feel what an asthma patient is feeling. I think there's no better way of illustrating that than to go back in time 3 years. The largest shipping company in the world, Maersk, they sit on 25% of all shipping, all cargo in the world. That means 1/4 of everything you see around yourself right now in the room you're sitting in has been delivered by Maersk. Well, Maersk reached out 3 years ago and they said we want to improve our Net Promoter Score, NPS, and the ENPS, the Employee Net Promoter Score. Now, again, you know the drill. I asked them, how often have you spent time with those customers in their offices? And the answer was no. They hadn't. Yeah, they spent time with them trying to sell, but rarely, if ever, had they been spending time listening to the customers. Now, I'm going to share a little model with you, because this is the model we used in order to turn around this problem. So what you see on the screen right now is really 4 dimensions. You have on the top should button, you have shouldn't, on the left do, and on the right don't. And in the bottom right corner, there's one fundamental question. Which of your products, services, or interactions would your customer like to improve or kill? Now, the next question on the bottom left is, what are the assumptions justifying that current approach you have? All the excuses are what we call the immune system, the defense mechanism for change. Now, if you continue up in the bottom or top left, you have, if we scrap this approach and stop pretending people were rational, what will we change? Remember the 85%? Remember pressing hard on the remote control? That is the majority of all the excuses down there. We can't ask people questions. We need to feel it instead, which leads me to the top right box, which says having 90 days to succeed. Which of your changes require the least effort to make the biggest impact? I'm saying 90 days because an organization have no patience whatsoever to wait for a year or two. Forget about it if you have the 2035 plan. Maybe it's nice for you to have a dot on the wall. It can help you to navigate towards an overall purpose. But in the end of the day, we as an organization have no patience. We have to see an instant gratification. So it leads me back to the first box. Now that box comes back to a little term I want to introduce for you right now. In shipping there is a term called rolling. Rolling means that if you want to ship a container from one place to another, and that container you booked to depart from that harbor is not leaving because suddenly someone else is paying a higher price for someone else, even though it was confirmed that the container you have would leave. That is called rolling. Not a big deal, you may say. Well, what we discovered spending time with customers around the world was, it is a big deal. Listen to this, 65% of all containers every week are rolled. 65%. So I went to Maersk, I said, you must be kidding. Why is that happening? And they said, well, listen, we're pretty good. It's only 62% for us. You get what I mean? So the first question is very simple. Why is my cargo rolled? This is a simple question every customer had in the mind. And that leads to the second thing. What are the assumptions justifying the current approach? Now, the answer here is very simple. Customers should be better at planning their logistics. It's their fault, not our fault. That is the industry's answer. Now, that's where you feel the immune system is coming into action. And the best way of illustrating that is basically to go one step further. Because what we have discovered over time is that when you want to make change in organizations, it's super difficult. Let me just prove my point. Take a look at this.
The 3 people on the left are actors. They've been briefed to stand or sit when they hear this. Everyone else that's brought in is a genuine shortlisted applicant. They've been given no instructions other than to fill out their forms. My team and I were secretly watching from another room. The more socially compliant a person is, the more they're likely to look to others for signs of how to behave.
This is going to be your spot.
And the more people, the greater the pressure to join in. In this case, whether to stand or sit. Those people that didn't follow the crowd were removed. And we got to lose Amy, sadly.
With me?
Once we had a full house, we got rid of the actors, leaving us with a room full of compliant people standing up and sitting down, even though nobody told them to do.
Poor Amy. A room full of compliant people. Listen, this is the biggest issue in company transformation and in establishing a purpose. When I spoke with Maersk, they all thought they're right. I mean, they were better than the industry standard, 62%, the rest is 65%. Yet, if I ask the customer, it's a slightly different perspective. Now, my dad always taught me that if you want to get ahead of the leaders, don't follow his tracks in the snow. One thing I've learned if you want to change the perspective of an organization is not to compare yourself with other people in your industry. It is to leave your industry and see the point of view from that industry. And that's exactly what we did with Maersk. We basically asked them, what is the company you really aspire to? Who's really good out there? And the answer was Uber. They all said, I love Uber. It's fantastic. It works. It's very efficient. It's simple, user-friendly. You don't need any legal stuff. And then we did a really simple exercise. We said to everyone, hey, let's try a game here. Why don't we try to simulate that Maersk buys Uber? Not Uber buying Maersk, but Maersk is buying Uber. And we had 80,000 people around the world simulating this game. In the end, we acquired all these different insights and created a little cartoon. Here it is. Just as the case was with this little straw, a penny suddenly dropped at Maersk. They realized how they see the world from one point of view, leading me back to the third question. If we scrap this approach and stop pretending people are rational, what we would change? Well, the answer was very simple. Let's ask for upfront payment and in return, remove rolling. And we did that as a 90 days intervention. And let me just share with you what the outcome looked like in order to explain this to the public. A little bit of a revolution in the world of shipping.
Imagine if a restaurant was like shipping. What would it be like? Well, ordering would mean lots of paperwork. And it's, complex. Once you placed your order, everything seems fine. Unless, of course, there's an overbooking. When that happens, you might be rolled. So, it's quite common to place extra orders, just to be on the safe side, but not always letting the supplier know that you did, and all the while the price might change, or extra fees might be added. This is quite a challenge, when all you want is a clear overview of your price.
At Maersk, we believe it's time for a change, and we're going all the way to make it happen. Introducing Maersk Spot, a loading guarantee, easy online booking, and a fixed price.
Fascinating. Fascinating when you think about how suddenly Maersk was dealing with its customers through a huge hate-to-hate way, so through human to human, which I think is so incredible important to do. And I think the point I have here is very simple. it worked. I mean, the NPS went up through the roof. We saw brand value going up as well, quite a lot. And even the share price over the last 2 years has gone up more than 300%, more than anyone else in the entire industry, which both of them were flat during the crisis. Very simple, because they suddenly started to see the world through a customer's point of view. But I want to pause here for a second, because there's a caveat to all this stuff. I think the best way of illustrating this is really to quote Richard Branson, which is all about culture. And Richard Branson was famous of saying one simple quote. He said, "Take care of your employees and they will take care of your customers." It was actually the philosophy which certainly for us impacted the work we did at Maersk, because we basically said in the end of the day, hey, we need to be better at creating a bond between the customer and our employees. Employees were just selling an inside-out solution, and we turned this perspective around. It's something really linking back to the story I began with in 1969, because actually what happened when JF Kennedy was saying this big vision about he wanted to put man on the moon, he was also supposedly later on quoted as he walked down the plants and were asking one of the staff a simple question. In fact, that staff member was a cleaner at the plant where they're building these rockets. And he said to the cleaner, "What is your job?" And the cleaner answered, "I'm here to put the man on the moon." This has been the philosophy I've learned works still today. When we talk about the pharma company, suddenly people felt why they were working there. When we talk about Maersk, they felt why people actually were transporting 1/4 of all medicine or medical products around the world to save the planet from COVID-19. All of that stuff was based and linked with an emotion. And that's really my point here, because I think what's happening in our world right now is that the role of marketing is changing profoundly. Everything has to be surrounded around a purpose instead. We cannot attract and retain staff if there's no purpose, because why should you care? We're just sitting in front of a screen. I can just click on another link and then I have another job. So we need to have a bigger purpose driving us, and that's exactly what we've been talking now. But what I also would claim happening is that there is a change going on in time. And what's changed is this, that we in the future will have both communication and marketing and culture, which is the Richard Branson reference I did, and sustainability coming together and define a new role in organizations. This is really the future of the Chief Marketing Officer. And really what you're looking at right now is customer experience. You can't do that in isolation, in a silo. It all has to come together, because everything has to, because the consumer do not understand why it's another department's responsibility for whatever you're doing. So my story is very simple. You actually have to start with the customer first and work backwards towards the technology. Now, if I should summarize this in a straightforward way, there's really 4 points. But first of all, back to Malcolm and my conversation, there is no such thing as B2B or B2C anymore. I call it H to H. Maya and Delia is talking all about the emotions you'd feel. This more than ever has become a prominent thing. And we're forgetting it because we sit behind our screens. But the reality is we have to get out of that in the field and get our hands dirty. And as I said, if you want to understand the animals, don't go to the zoo, go to the Amazon. We need to spend time with the customers in the real environment and not sell to them, but actually feel what they're feeling. And through that metaphor we're using, bring it back to the organization. Now, how do we convince the conversation to change their mind? Very simple. We have to change the perspective, project it from another industry. As my dad was saying, don't follow the leader's tracks in the snow. If you do that, you'll never get ahead. That's what we did with Uber. That is to basically project another company on top and see it through that lens so people can feel what the pain is like from a customer's point of view. And this, in reality, is my little talk today. If I should summarize it, because this is not easy, I know, with a few words, it's very simple. Act your way into new ways of thinking rather than think your way into a new way of acting. So I guess, Morana, these are my few words. I know you have a lot of questions, so I'll hand it over to you.
Martin, thank you so much. So wonderful and so many wonderful insights. Now, I'm sure our audience have many questions as well. And again, I encourage you to please drop them in the Q&A and we'll make sure we pull those up. But as our audience is thinking through theirs, I do have one question for you. You talked a lot about blurring boundaries, business and personal, human and digital. This requires that we gain a broader point of view. What we've observed is that that broader point of view has to begin with the most senior leaders in organizations. Now, it's often that it's those very same leaders that sort of have the short code and that they are the most convicted in their own points of view about what employees or customers may need. So my question to you is, what can leaders do, or maybe what can we do to help our leaders gain that broader perspective?
Well, it's a good question, and I'll tell you a secret. You need to go under the radar, and you need to prove that change actually is worth doing it. I'll tell you a fun story. So one of our clients is Standard Chartered Bank. It's one of the 10 largest banks in the world. And I was doing a workshop, and there was this wonderful lady, and she was, I would say, mid-management to lower management in this huge bank, 88,000 staff. And I remember she was so frustrated working in the bank because there's so much compliance going on that you really can't breathe, right? So one day I was running this workshop. She said to me, Martin, I'm over this. I'm resigning. And it's one thing I would hate happening on my watch. It's a person resigning, right? So I said to her, let's come up with a different idea. So I said to her, what would you like to change? She said, I would like to start up a ministry. I said, a ministry? Yeah. Let's call it a ministry of common sense. I said, why don't we do it? So we literally started up a ministry of common sense. And she said to her friends and colleagues, hey, what are you most frustrated about? And I'll tell you, there was a lot of frustration going on. She put up a little website and she asked people to submit the biggest frustrations. And there was a lot of frustrations coming up. And then she asked people to submit as well a little way to navigate around it. And within about 3 months, she actually had the most popular internal website in the company. Those thousands of people submitting all the issues and all the solutions to it. And then she took 3 of those small issues and implemented them straight away. And immediately had an impact. Within 90 days it had. And at that stage she said, let's elevate it through the system. And we took those cases, which now clearly showed an ROI, clear was time efficient, it improved the ENPS. In fact, it actually improved the NPS we thought. We didn't know it at that stage. We showed it to the senior management and they said, why don't we just do it across the company? And that became the Ministry of Common Sense, which later on became my book.
It's wonderful, and it's such a great example of listening to the people that are the closest to what is actually happening in the organization. So speaking of the Ministry of Common Sense, you talk about in the book about stumbling upon a television remote control. I think it was in one of your travels in maybe a hotel. And you said you could literally see all of the departments trying to get what they need in this product. But for the customer, it was such a big mess. I think you had actually bumped into the engineer on a plane. So my question to you is, as we design experiences and products for our customers, how do we make sure that our own silos, our own structures don't get in the way of delivering a great experience or a great service?
It's a great question, and I think the best way I can answer that is probably to take you to Shanghai. Now, going back to Maersk, we were sitting in a call center, I remember, and we were listening into the conversations going on between all the customers complaining and how Maersk would handle those complaints. And what I was so surprised about was that time after time, they would categorize that complaint as force majeure. And both you and I know force majeure means an act of God, basically meaning an earthquake or COVID-19, right? So something you can't control. But every single complaint was because of that? I doubt it. So we started to find out why, and the answer was really simple. If you fill out the answer, or you fill in the answer is force majeure into that customer complaint form in the call center, you only had to fill out 1 page. But in fact, if you don't click force majeure, you had to fill out 3 pages. And then you may say, not a big deal. Well, it was, because what we realized was that the customer service department was measured on time, not on NPS, so the customer happiness. And that is really symptomatic for what's happening in our world today. Let me just see if we can illustrate it. So if I take the good old days, and I'll just do a little drawing here on the screen right now. So in good old days, you will notice that companies would be measured on happy customers and if they earn money. Very simple KPIs defining them. Then what happened was that suddenly things would change. Wall Street will come in and take over. They would like to have quarterly announcement earnings, and that meant that in fact that arrow I showed you there is wrong. It will no longer be one straight arrow. It will be sort of smaller arrows, each of them indicating a different set of KPIs, right? So suddenly these KPIs would, of course, hopefully give some good information to Wall Street so people could invest in the company. Everything worked fine because the silver lining always was the customer. It came from a customer background, so the departments was kind of aligned around it. But then something remarkable happened. Back in the 80s, suddenly, these small arrows started to become their own little ecosystem. They were pointing in each of the different directions. They're swirling around because these KPIs were really linked with the department and nothing else. So suddenly that silver lining disappeared and people really couldn't care less about what the other department were doing. And this is a very important point because one of the things I've learned is that today KPIs are not aligned within the organization. And as a consequence of that, there's no incentive for departments to work together. So I want to quote a wonderful friend of mine. His name is Alan Molly. Alan Molly was voted as the top CEO over a decade in the United States. He was the CEO of Ford, and he also turned around Boeing. I mean, an extraordinary guy. And when I spoke to Alan about how he came around that challenge I just shared with you there, he had a very simple philosophy. He basically said, we can give people 3 different scores, their own personal KPIs. First of all, how well are you doing? Well, you can get a score of 2 out of 2. 0 is really bad, of course, 1 or 2. Fantastic. Then he said, how well is the company doing? Out of 2? Well, let's say it's really good, it's 2. Okay, fantastic. But then he did a trick. He basically said, hey, let's try to do another dimension. We want the company to work together, departments to work together. So he had a 3rd score, that is, how good are you at working with other departments and other people? So through 360 peer reviews, and through that analysis, you'll be scored on that. Now, good news, if you're really good at working with people, then you got suddenly right now a score of 8. But what if, for example, I gave you a score of 0? Well, we all know then that then the total score will be 0. And that actually was his technique to turn around Ford and Boeing. And it comes back to the silos, and it comes back to that particular question you just asked.
That's wonderful. And we now have a question from the audience. And actually, it's going to be a live question. So, Palma, thank you so much. Please go ahead and ask your question.
That is the most simple question I ever had, I have to say. Silent.
Oh, I'm sorry. It sounds like we have some technical challenges. Thanks, Martin, for cueing me. So I do have a quit here. So here's the question. Becoming a purpose-driven business for employees and customers is something that many brands are after, but we know it's not easy and it's transformation. So what do you believe are the biggest errors organizations make when they set out on this transformation? And thanks, Palma, for typing that in.
There's two big errors. The first error is that organization paint a picture which is not specific for the organization. It becomes a bunch of cliche words that put in together, and those words actually don't differentiate the organization a lot, but they're saying what we want to hear in our world today. That's the biggest risk we have. So we end up with a cliche. And the second thing, which is even more scary, is that people don't live it. A purpose is only worth when you start to live it. I remember I, many years ago, spoke to the founder's son of Lego, Gottfried Kirk Christiansen. And he said back in the days that he actually literally would call people randomly at any time of the day and ask them, what is the purpose of Lego? And people actually were able to answer it because it was waved into the DNA, into the fabric of the organization and the philosophy. I don't think I can do that with a lot of companies today. I think a lot of people think of a purpose of some cliche slogan hanging on the wall and a very nice plaque. But how many really truly live it? And why is it so important? Because if you as an organization start to live it, then suddenly it shows through every touch point. I mean, you can have the most amazing product let's say an airline company, where the seats are really very amazing, but the service is horrible, I mean, then you will remember the bad service. You won't remember that amazing seat. And I think the issue we have here is that we're disconnecting things for all these silo approaches. So you have to be extremely unique in your purpose, and that requires you to have an edge to it. You can't just round the corner. It has to really have an edge. And second, you really have to live it. And if you can't live it, just don't do it. It's a waste of time then.
So I love that you said you have to live the purpose, and the work that we do with our clients, this is such a key component of, you can't have it become a strategic artifact or a poster on a wall. What do you believe are some of the best and simplest ways to have every employee, every leader live the organizational purpose?
I think it comes down not only to what we talked about previously with living what the customer is living, so exchanging a sense of empathy, that's the straw story, that is the feeling of how do I feel what the customer is feeling. If you do not feel that, it's so difficult to create a purpose which is powerful, but if you felt it yourself, it's much more convincing. So this is the first thing. But the second thing relates to something I experienced many years ago when I was asked by one of the senior people in UAE, so in United Arab Emirates, to basically put Dubai on the world map. And I remember Mr. Majid Al-Futtaim, he called me and he said, hey, I would like you to establish something which can make our kingdom become different. So here's what happened. We went out in the desert and we were looking around, and he said, so what's your thinking? And I said, I have a crazy idea. Why don't we make it cold in the desert? Why don't we make it snow in the desert? Hot, cold? I mean, creativity is to combine two ordinary things in a new way, right? So we created Ski Dubai. And Ski Dubai was very different because it really had 4 different corners. If you take a look at my little square now, it had 4 corners. One was, it had real penguins in the middle of the desert. It had real ski lifts. It had real ski cabins, and it had real ski tracks in the desert. And all those 4 dimensions really created this powerful ski landscape. Now, what happened was that suddenly people started to say, this is very expensive to do. So they said, we love the idea, it's fantastic, but what about these kids? They're coming from the cold and from the heat into the cold, and suddenly they get a cold and they'll get sick and they'll fall in the snow and they'll slip and will be sued by the parents. And what about these small penguins? This is horrible. Why don't we change those penguins to robot penguins? In fact, I have a better idea. Why don't we change all the snow to become just plastic snow instead? In fact, what about this idea? Why don't we change it to become, let's say, a computer game instead? Wouldn't that be amazing? No, play a game in the snow in the desert. In fact, I have a better idea. Why don't we just create a pamphlet? Let's have snow in the desert. And what suddenly happened here was that these corners, originally defining that whole grand idea, collapsed. It became rounder and rounder. I call that rounding the corners. And that is exactly what a purpose is doing when it's doing it the wrong way. We are rounding the corners. We come with something with a very strong edge, clearly creating a point of differentiation. And then the politics, the immune system start to round the corners more and more, and you end up with a shadow of your own right. Now today, Ski Dubai is still there. The price tag to develop it back in the days was $9 million. Today, more than 1 billion people have been visiting Ski Dubai. It's the second biggest attraction of people in the Middle East. You have Mecca, number 1 in Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and then you have Ski Dubai in Dubai. And it gives you a sense of that courage of creating something different. And I want to add one thing, because then you can say to me, what's the purpose of this? It actually is to create memories, happy memories. And the best way that was illustrated was last year, where there's a little kid who had never seen there's real snow in his entire life, had been training, standing on ski in Ski Dubai his whole life. And then he became an Olympic game medalist. He actually went to the Olympic Games and won a medal, and he's learned everything in Ski Dubai. That gives me goosebumps, and that shows you suddenly that purpose of creating memories every day of your life really started to be real, right?
Martin, I love that story. I've heard you tell it a couple of times, and every time I get as inspired with it as I did the first time I heard it. And our friends at Forrester often talk about effectiveness, ease, and emotion. And I think this is such a perfect example of going outside of boundaries, being creative, having the courage to think outside of the constraints to really be able to create emotion, and in this case, to create meaningful memories for your customers. So what a wonderful example. I do have a couple of questions from the audience, so thank you so much for continuing on with us. One question is, how do we create empathy and connection on what customers need when there are cultural differences and realities that we do not connect with or understand?
It's a very good question. I think the headline to this question is really that you need to find what we call the universal truth. Universal truth, it happens for everyone. We all get the goosebump moment. We all feel the same, and there's not such a big difference between all of us as you would think. The best way of doing it is to understand the key to empathy. Empathy is the ability to put yourself in the shoes of another person and feel what that person is feeling. It's very different from sympathy. Sympathy is really, the way I try to explain it is that if you're standing on a ship one day and there's a person standing next to you and she's very seasick, let's say, then sympathy is to say, I'm really sorry, and give her a napkin. And empathy is you start to throw up with her, right? So that's the difference between sympathy and empathy. And I think it gives you a sense of that you're much more invested or vested in this whole feeling. The way you work with empathy is it's like a muscle. And the more you train that muscle, the better. I've been very introvert over the years, but as I spent time in more than 3,000 consumer homes, no kidding, across more than 100 countries over the last 15 years, I built up a sense of empathy. So it's something you can actually learn or you can maintain it. And you do that by observing people. And one of the ways you should observe people and get empathy back is actually, I know you're going to hate what I'm saying, Morana, but I'm saying it anyway, sorry, right? But you need to be more present as a person. That means you shouldn't use your phone as much as we do today. Think about this. When you are standing in a bar waiting for something or someone, what's the first thing you do? You grab your phone and you do anything with it. Anything so you don't look like a complete loser, right? So this is number one. We don't meet people anymore. The first thing you do when I went to a Coldplay concert the other day, 2 weeks ago in London. I don't think a single person saw Coldplay singing. They're all sitting with their screens in front of them, right? So we don't see things anymore. But the third thing is the worst. We never get bored anymore. And boredom is the foundation for creativity. It's that pause in our life where we reflect and combine two ordinary things in a new way. That pause is what we need. We are spoon-fed with stuff all the time. It's this injection of Netflix, injection of entertainment all the time. And as soon as we have 5 minutes for ourselves, we go into kind of a panic mode. But this is a moment where you actually learn how to create empathy with other people. Here's the scary part. There was a study done by University of Michigan recently. It shows that the degree of empathy has dropped 48.5% over the last decade alone. And that was before COVID-19. Now, that means we're even dropping more. That means the biggest competitive edge you can have is to establish a workforce which feels a sense of empathy. So what we, for example, are doing with this pharma company is that when people are onboarding, they get a kit. And in that kit, there is a straw. And they're asked to breathe through the straw to feel what the patients are feeling. That is a way to translate it. And once everyone does it, that becomes the emotional, you could say, language or lingo between everyone. They feel the same. And then it's easier to do R&D, it's easier to do communication, and guess what? It's much easier to develop a purpose.
Martin, I love that. You know, you're the second person in the last 24 hours that I heard say, find the pause. The first one was the Peloton instructor. So I think it's the universe trying to tell me something as well. But to that question around understanding or being empathetic when there are cultural differences, what I hear you say is, don't walk a mile, not just walk a mile in the shoe of your customers or employees, walk with them. And that breathing through a straw is a perfect example of how you walk with them to be able to understand those differences. Okay, so one more question before we close off. There's a question about KPIs. So what KPIs do you think are overused and or underused by companies when trying to build brand loyalty?
I think the KPIs which are overused is the fact that we have too many KPIs. I know of companies which have 40, 50, 60 KPIs. Let's just try and experiment for fun. Let's say you have 40 KPIs. That means you can maximum allocate 1.5% for whatever you want to do. That means in your organization, I could be 1.5% customer focused, right? So how many days is that? Let's say that's on a good shiny day, 4 days a year. We could be customer focused, and then we go to something else right on. I don't need to tell you, it's not working that way. The best thing you can do with KPIs is to cut it down. Rule of thumb, no more than 5 KPIs, okay? One of them, of course, should be customer. And my advice to you is at least 30% of your KPIs should be allocated around a customer focus. That should be an NPS, meaning would your customers recommend this brand to a friend of yours, or whatever it is, but that type of questions. I think the KPIs which are destroying the most is not a particular KPI, but the fact that they're different from department to department. When they're different from department to department, they're not incentivized to work together. That means we're all working in different directions, coming back to that little model I shared with you. And I think a lot of companies don't get that. Oh yeah, we have different functions, we can't have the same KPIs. Yes, you do. Yes, you can, because you have a customer and they actually expect one thing. It's not like you have schizophrenic customers out there. They want to have certain things which are defined really well and very clearly, right? So you need to be very aware of that. You should send the same signal throughout the entire organization to make everyone work together, because that creates a sense of belonging internally, and that sense of belonging creates a tribe and a movement, and that movement really builds brands, in my opinion.
Martin, thank you so much. We're nearly at the top of the hour. I really want to thank you again for joining us and sharing your wonderful experiences and your wonderful insights. And to our audience members that have joined us for the first time or have come back for Bond.Forums, thank you so much for joining us. We hope that you continue to join us in future sessions as we talk about customer experience, brand, purpose, loyalty, and other things. Thank you again for your time, and have a wonderful day. Martin, thank you. See you soon.
Thank you.